Hello BookTube, how's it going? So it is Thursday once again, and so I would like to do another video for Poetry Thursday, hopefully keeping it relatively short. And I thought that I would read a poem by a writer who, when he's named, most people don't immediately think of him as a poet. And I also, because it's Pride Month, thought that I would read a poem from this little collection. So this is Love Speaks Its Name, Gay and Lesbian Love Poems. This is edited by J.D. McClatchy. It's a part of the Everyman's Library Pocket Poets series, which I love those series. They're these lovely little volumes, but this one is all love poems written to people of the same sex. And the poem I want to read is the one poem in here that's included by James Baldwin, who is much more well known as a fiction and nonfiction prose writer. He's famous for novels like Go Tell It on the Mountain and Another Country and Giovanni's Room, a classic gay novel, of course, and then nonfiction like The Fire Next Time, among many other essay collections. But he did write poetry, actually. He wrote a little bit of poetry in his life. My understanding is he didn't write a ton, but he wrote some. Now, what's interesting here is that generally when you learn about writers who are primarily known for working in one form, so if they're most well known as a novelist, most well known as a playwright, most well known as a poet, if you know of a writer who's most well known for working in one kind of literary form, and then you find out at some point down the line, oh, by the way, they also wrote, they also dabbled in writing this something else, right? So, like for example, Harold Pinter, most well known as a playwright, but actually did write poetry. And he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Willa Cather, I believe, wrote poetry. Obviously most well known for her fiction. Edith Wharton, most well known for her fiction, but wrote poetry. Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, both most well known for their fiction, but also wrote poetry. Generally, at least when it comes to poetry, if you know of a writer whose work primarily is in some other form, in the novel or in nonfiction or in plays, and then you happen to find out that they also wrote poetry, generally the poetry is awful. Even if the writer himself or herself thought of themselves as a poet, as a central part of their identity, like Roberto Bolaño, for example, again, most well known for his fiction, but wrote a lot of poetry and apparently thought of himself primarily as a poet. Generally, when you hear about those cases, the poetry is awful, with notable exceptions. So like Sylvia Plath, for example, I mean, it's hard to know how she would have done if she'd actually been able to keep writing, if she'd lived longer, but she wrote great poetry and at least one great novel, The Bell Jar. You've got Samuel Beckett as well, I would argue, wrote great plays, great novels, and I think some great poetry. Again, not a lot of poetry, but what poetry he did write, I think, was pretty excellent. And I think James Baldwin is another notable exception. Now, I can't speak to all of his poetry because actually this is the only poem by him that I've read. I've read a couple of his novels too, and I love his writing in prose. But I love this poem by him as well. And so this poem makes me suspect that he is another one of the exceptions, that he probably did write at least some really great poetry, as well as all the other wonderful stuff that he wrote. So anyway, I thought that I would read you this poem by James Baldwin. It's called Munich, Winter 1973. And in parentheses below the title, it says 4YS, the initials YS. I don't know who that is, but presumably it is a love poem to a man whose initials were YS, I'm going to guess. The poem is a little bit on the longer side, not too long, but a little bit on the longer side. I think it's beautiful. I would love to hear your thoughts. Right? So here is Munich, Winter 1973 by James Baldwin. In a strange house, a strange bed, in a strange town, a very strange me is waiting for you. Now it is very early in the morning. The silence is loud. The baby is walking about with his foaming bottle, making strange sounds and deciding, after all, to be my friend. You arrived tonight. How dull time is, how empty, and yet, since I am sitting here, lying here, walking up and down here, waiting, I see that time's cruel ability to make one wait is time's reality. I see your hair, which I call red. I lie here in this bed. Someone teased me once, a friend of ours, saying that I saw your hair red because I was not thinking of the hair on your head. Someone also told me a long time ago, my father said to me, "It is a terrible thing, son, to fall into the hands of the living God." Now, I know what he was saying. I could not have seen red before finding myself in this strange, this waiting bed. Nor had my naked eye suggested that color was created by the light falling, now on me, in this strange bed, waiting where no one has ever rested. The streets, I observe, are wintry. It feels like snow. Starlings circle in the sky, conspiring together and alone, unspeakable journeys into and out of the light. I know I will see you tonight, and snow may fall enough to freeze our tongues and scald our eyes. We may never be found again, just as the birds above our heads circling are singing, knowing that in what lies before them, the always unknown passage, wind, water, air, the failing light, the falling night, the blinding sun, they must get the journey done. Listen, they have wings and voices, are making choices, are using what they have. They are aware that, on long journeys, each bears the other, whirring, stirring, love occurring in the middle of the terrifying air. All right, I think that's beautiful. I realized my reading was a little bit I stumbled over a couple of things, unfortunately. I did read the poem before doing the reading, but I don't have the poem memorized or anything, so I feel like I maybe didn't get everything out in the way that might be ideal. But I think the poem's lovely. I also like I think there's a little bit of humor in there. And yeah, I'd be curious to hear what you think of that poem. If you've read any of James Baldwin's other poetry, which again, my understanding is that there's not a lot of it, but if you have read it, I'd be curious to know what you think of it, because this is the only one I've read so far. Again, good first impression, but haven't read anything else, right? So that's all. I will leave it at that. I'll talk to you all soon.